Thank you for joining us for this Prairie Tales podcast. Today, our wagon train to the past is taking us back to the prairie in 1873. Specific incidents include the assassination of saloon keeper Jim Shay, and attempted murder of livery stable owner A. Shuster, the fatal shooting of buffalo hunter Peter Dunningham, and the domestic struggles and tragic suicide of August Santoff, whose wife Caroline later married another man also prone to violence. Grab the reins tightly, wagons ho! Today's episode is sponsored by our friend on the trail, John Wise of Wichita, Kansas. John hosts the Travel with a Wise Guy YouTube channel, where he bravely explores the unknown to show us the towns and ghost towns of Kansas and beyond. You'll surely want to take some side trips on his stagecoach by finding him at the YouTube station.
You've shared a really fascinating set of local newspaper articles with us today, mostly from Newton, Kansas, and nearby areas, all from 1873.
That's right.
And looking through them, what really jumps out is this vivid picture they paint of a community that's, well, changing incredibly quickly.
Absolutely. And what makes these 1873 accounts so valuable, I think, is that they really do capture this very specific moment in time. You can almost feel the push for progress. Farmers, merchants, families starting to settle the open prairie, building businesses, trying to establish lives. Mm-hmm. But then as we dig into these pages you've provided, we also see the other side, let's say, the stark reality that murder and mayhem were still, well, very much part of the picture on the frontier.
Right. That tension.
Exactly. And our goal today is really to explore that very tension, this simultaneous growth and development alongside these persistent dangers. And we'll do it through these firsthand reports, these voices from the time.
Okay, so let's start with that growth aspect. There's an article in the Newton Kansan, April 17th, 1873, that really sets a tone. It says, "No town in the state has undergone the change it has, been as bad and yet now as reformed, suffered the same amount of abuse, and yet made as rapid progress and growth as Newton has today." I mean, that's a pretty bold claim about where the town was headed, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Definitely. And consider this, that very same date, April 17th, but just 2 years earlier in 1871, that's when the first lumber was unloaded. That basically marks the founding of Newton.
Wow. Only 2 years.
Exactly. So it really highlights just how incredibly fast they felt things were transforming. A town basically springing up out of nowhere and already talking about moving past a rough start towards something more West established.
And you found a specific example of that push for reform, right? Something from the May 29th, 1873, Newton Kansan?
Yes. It mentions the sale of the Hyde Park property. Now, this place was apparently known locally as a den of brothels.
Okay.
And the paper reports it's now become a hardware store.
Huh. From a den of brothels to hardware. That's quite a shift.
It really is. It's a very tangible sign, isn't it? Trying to reshape the town's image, moving away from vice towards something practical, something needed for a growing community of settlers and families. It's a powerful symbol of wanting to build something more respectable, more solid.
But it seems like maybe not everyone was fully convinced by Newton's own sunny view of itself. The Hutchinson News, a neighboring town paper from April 10th, 1873, offers a slightly different perspective.
A bit more skeptical, perhaps.
Yeah, you could say that. They acknowledge Newton getting the railroad division, which was obviously a huge deal for growth, but then they throw in this little jab, saying, "Alas, poor Newton, you have buried too many of your noble citizens with their boots on to ever recover."
Oof. With their boots on.
Exactly. A pretty stark reminder that, despite all the talk of reform and progress, the violence was still very much a reality, at least in the eyes of their neighbors.
It absolutely is. Mm-hmm. That phrase, "with their boots on," meaning dying violently, it just gets right through the optimism, doesn't it? It suggests that while Newton was maybe trying to project this reformed image, others remembered the bodies. Mm. It makes you wonder what reformed really meant back then. Maybe more of an ambition than a completed fact.
And it wasn't just outsiders saying this. Even Newton's own paper, the Kansan, around late May 73, mentions the town having 4 licensed saloons. Okay, they were under bond to keep order, and there was a marshal.
Right, trying to regulate it.
But still, 4 licensed saloons. It shows they were trying to establish some law and order licenses, bonds, enforcement. But The fact that these places existed and needed regulating kind of points to the fact that the elements that often led to trouble were still very much present.
Precisely. It's this fascinating balancing act you see in these frontier towns. They're trying to attract settlers, farmers, businesses by seeming stable and orderly, while also dealing with the rougher realities.
Which leads us right into the mayhem part. Because alongside all this growth and attempts at order, these newspapers you found have some pretty grim stories. Let's start with Jim Shay's assassination in February 1873. The details seem a bit fuzzy depending on the source.
They do, yeah. It's common with these older accounts. The Hutchinson News calls him notorious, already setting a tone, and says he was shot 3 times on a Sunday night by someone unknown.
And they weren't exactly shedding tears for him either, were they?
Not at all. They bluntly state he did not meet his doom sooner than he deserved. Pretty harsh judgment. But then other papers, like the Junction City Weekly Union and the Kansas Chief, they report 5 shots, not 3.
Interesting.
And the Kansas Chief adds a bit more context, saying Shay ran a dance house and had lived in Abilene during the Texas cattle trade days. That potentially links him to that whole rough-and-tumble cattle town scene.
And then there's that detail from the Leavenworth Daily Times that he was shot outside a restaurant holding a can of oysters.
Yeah, that little detail, it feels so specific, doesn't it? It kind of grounds the violence in this mundane moment. Makes it feel more immediate somehow.
It really does. And it also shows why looking at multiple sources is so important, especially back then. Each paper gives you a slightly different angle.
Exactly. The number of shots, where exactly it happened. The details might vary, but the core fact is stark. A man tied to the savory side of frontier life was murdered. It's clear proof that despite Newton's talk of being reformed, that violence was still right there.
Okay, then let's talk about Abraham Shuster in May 1873. This one seems, well, it starts out almost strange based on the initial reports you found.
It does, yeah. Shuster was a local businessman, livery stable, feed store, had a farm outside town. The early accounts describe him as pretty resourceful. He'd apparently been west trading for buffalo hides, even had an encounter with Native Americans. Shows the kind of risks and opportunities people were pursuing beyond the town limits.
Right, part of that wider frontier experience. And then comes this report about trouble at his farm. Armed men show up, doctors arrive. Sounds dramatic.
Yeah.
But the paper initially dismisses it as just a little altercation of no serious character, even calls it a joke.
Yeah, it makes it sound like a big misunderstanding, maybe some drunken antics blown out of proportion.
But that wasn't the real story, was it, as you dug into it more?
No, not at all. What that first report completely glossed over was that just days before that joke, Shuster had actually filed a formal criminal complaint.
Ah.
In it, he claimed a man named Henry Knife had hired another man, Lewis Clark, to kill him, and he alleged that Clark did shoot at him and actually hit him.
So the little altercation was actually an attempted murder charge.
Precisely. It's a really striking example of how early reports could sometimes minimize or even hide serious violence. Maybe, to keep up appearances for the town.
Could be. And the trouble didn't stop there for Shuster's family, did it?
No, sadly. Just a couple of months later, in July 73, news came that his wife's brother, a man named Louis Klingensmith, who apparently went by a whole list of aliases like L.J. Wallace, Gingham Davis, Louis Judson, A.J. Clark.
Wow, quite the list.
He was shot and killed down in Dallas, Texas. It just shows how interconnected these lives were and how violence could ripple outwards, touching families across the map during this period of expansion and movement.
Yeah, it definitely paints a picture of instability.
It really does. And when you look at later events for the Shusters, his own death in 1890, his livery stable burning down in 93, it suggests that achieving lasting peace and security was a real struggle for many folks trying to make a go of it on the prairie. It wasn't always just about opportunity, there was hardship too.
Okay, moving into the summer, July 1873, there's the case of Peter Dunningham. He wasn't from Newton itself, but from Halstead nearby, right? And another buffalo hunter.
That's right. Ties him into that same frontier economy, that often rougher lifestyle outside the main towns. His story actually plays out in Great Bend.
What happened there?
Well, the reports say he got arrested and fined for being drunk. Then he apparently made threats against the city marshal, a man named James Gainsford, and ended up assaulting him.
Not a good move.
No. The marshal, Gainsford, shot and killed Dunningham. A coroner's jury later ruled it justifiable homicide, self-defense.
Okay.
What's interesting is the newspaper notes this was the first affair of the kind in Great Bend. It suggests that maybe, while violence wasn't unheard of, this kind of deadly clash involving law enforcement was still a pretty significant, maybe even shocking event for that growing community.
Then fast forward to November 1873, we have Harry Lovett. He was one of Newton's early citizens, you said.
Yes, identified as one of the early settlers, someone who'd been there helping build the place up. He gets shot down in Dodge City.
Dodge City, okay. Another rough spot.
Definitely. And the initial news was grim. Shot in the chest, not expected to make it.
But this one has a different ending.
Thankfully, yes. Later information shows that Harry Lovett actually survived. He recovered, came back to the Newton area, and took up farming.
That's good to hear. A bit of resilience amidst the danger.
It is. It's a small reminder, but an important one, that not every encounter with violence ended tragically. People did endure. They did try to build more settled lives, farming the prairie, moving beyond that initial chaotic phase.
Okay, finally, let's look at the Santoff case, starting December 1873. This one feels different, giving us a look inside a family dealing with, well, domestic issues, right?
Yes, exactly. It opens a window onto a kind of violence that was likely common, but maybe less often documented publicly: domestic abuse. Caroline Santoff filed a complaint against her husband, August.
What did she allege?
It was quite harrowing. She described repeated assaults, beatings, general mistreatment, and even threats against her life. Her sworn statement says she genuinely believed he would harm her if something wasn't done.
That's awful. And they were immigrants trying to make a new life?
Yes. Both born in Prussia, they had a daughter, Rosina. They'd moved from Indiana to Newton, presumably seeking opportunity like so many others, settling the plains. It really underscores that the challenges weren't just external from the landscape or outlaws, but could also be deeply personal, internal struggles within the home. The hope of the frontier didn't magically fix everything.
And the story gets even sadder, doesn't it? A year later.
It does. In December 1874, August Santoff died by suicide, shooting himself at their home. The report suggests a mix of things might have contributed to illness, maybe those domestic troubles, alcohol. His wife, Caroline, was the only witness.
That's tragic. And did things improve for Caroline after that?
Well, the story continues, unfortunately. She remarried a man named Fred Mink, sometimes called Fritz. But it seems he also had a temper. In 1877, there were reports of him assaulting his own brother-in-law, Michael Tim.
So more violence?
More violence. There were legal proceedings, fines. Interestingly, Mink was eventually acquitted, but the court costs were charged to Tim, the victim. Yes. And later, there was a sheriff's sale of Fred and Caroline Mink's property. It just paints this picture of ongoing turmoil, legal problems, financial instability.
And what happened to Mink in the end?
The last piece of information we have is a brief note reporting Fritz Mink's death down in Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1879. It's just this long, sad chain of events that really highlights the hardship and instability that could follow these families trying to carve out lives on the frontier.
Absolutely. It's a powerful counterpoint to the narrative of simple progress and opportunity, isn't it? Shows the human cost, the struggles that were happening alongside the town building.
It really does. These individual stories, pulled right from the local papers you shared, they give us that crucial human dimension. We see the grand plans for growth, but also the personal tragedies playing out.
So wrapping this up, as we look back at Newton in 1873 through these articles, that central tension you mentioned at the start is just crystal clear. You've got this undeniable drive for growth, this ambition to build a stable, respectable community as farmers and merchants arrive to settle the prairie. You see it in the town's own pronouncements and things like turning brothels into hardware stores.
Definitely that push towards order and settlement.
But then, woven right through it all, are these incredibly stark realities of violence. The assassinations like Shay's, the attempted murder of Shuster, the deadly fights like Dunningham's, the shootings like Lovett's, and the awful domestic situation of the Santoffs. The mayhem was still right there.
And that's why these newspaper excerpts you brought us are so incredibly valuable. They don't sanitize it. They give us this unfiltered, boots on the ground view of a community really grappling with itself. It wasn't a neat transition from wild to tamed. The progress and the peril were happening at the same time, shaping everyday life.
Which leaves us with something to think about, maybe. When we hear about a frontier town becoming reformed, like the Newton Tanzan claimed, what does that actually mean in light of these stories? Considering this constant undercurrent and sometimes overcurrent of violence, what does it tell us about how progress really happens and the sheer difficulty of, taming the frontier, not just the land, but maybe human nature, too?
It's complex. There aren't easy answers, but these accounts certainly force us to confront those contradictions.
They really do. It's a much richer and maybe messier picture than we sometimes imagine.